Well, thank you so much for coming, and welcome to the very first session of City Forum for this academic year, the speaker series of the graduate program in Community and Regional Planning. So, show of hands, how many are students in CRP? Yeah, okay. How many are students in architecture but not CRP? Okay. And how many are non-students? Okay. We welcome, that would include faculty, huh? Oh, Ming, there was a seat up here. That's okay. And we highly welcome practitioners to come to this. It's, the interchange with you guys is really important for us. So, and CRP faculty, please raise your hand. I know some of you may not know. Jake, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Zakcq Lockrem, just starting as a new assistant professor. And I don't have my name quite up, but I'm on the second floor of Sutton, and I'll be posting some office hours. I'd love to meet with those of you who are interested in housing for the housing and real estate related issues, or just want to talk. So,
yeah.
Good to meet all of you.
So he's in Terry Kahn's old office, which is right next door to mine. And Professor Zhang is here. And I don't see any other students happening. Okay. Well, I'm really happy to introduce Zakcq Lockrem. Zakcq is a combines planning, design, and engagement. So he is going to talk to us about how he uses stakeholder and public engagement as part of the design and planning process, not as an activity that needs to be checked off, oh yeah, we did that. So creative and productive uses of engagement. And he has a bachelor's in urban affairs from Boston University and a master's from the Harvard Graduate School of Design in urban planning. And he's working with he's done a fair amount of international work with a focus on Asia. And he's working with the firm, the planning and design consulting firm, Asakura Robinson. He's in the Austin office and works internationally as well as in the U.S. and locally. And their main office is in Houston. So let's give a welcome to Zakcq.
Thanks. And it's okay with everyone if I stay sitting down and everyone can hear me okay? Yeah? Great. Okay. Well, yeah, let me just start with a little introduction to myself, because I know as students that can be interesting, just seeing how people came into planning and design. I grew up in Minneapolis and started out going to the University of Minnesota. Made it through about 2 years there before I realized I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I was doing political science at the time. But decided to drop out and take a teaching gig doing English in Germany. So I moved to Germany for a couple of years. And it was really there in Berlin that I started to really realize that the city was an object of study that was really interesting to me. And it was something that you could actually do as a professional. So after that, I came back to the States, moved to Boston, and finished up a degree in urban affairs at Boston University, and then went directly into the planning program at Harvard Graduate School of Design. And so spent about 6 years total in Boston. As I was finishing up my degree, my partner decided that she wanted to go for a PhD and ended up moving to Rice University to do a PhD in anthropology. And so I ended up in Houston without ever having visited Texas, and did not expect to end up in Houston, and did not necessarily see it as a place that someone who is interested in planning would want to end up. But that said, I've always been really interested in urban theory and in really some of the theory that's behind the practice of planning, and really found that Houston was a really fascinating workshop for thinking about planning ideas, because you were so unrestricted in the types of solutions that you could come up with. On the one hand, in working in Houston, you don't really have the same tools that you have working in other cities, but on the other hand, you have this sort of incredible freedom that comes from being in a place that's almost totally unrestricted in its approaches that you can take. And it's really through that work and my work with Asakura Robinson, where I'm now a principal and the director of planning, that we've worked together to really define a practice of planning that's been based on some of these ideas that we've had. And a lot of that is based around this idea of human infrastructure. And that is really taking planning as a field as being something that's really focused on social relationships and the way that those are structured in space. And so that's really the highlight or the center of the way that we practice planning. And it comes from an understanding of thinking about the ways in which people have the ability to carry out a plan and the reasons that they may or may not want to do that. And really being people-centric in the way that planning happens and understanding that, especially in a context where you have very few of the tools that a planner normally has, zoning, regulation, that it's really being people-centric is a potential tool of a planner. And so that's really the direction that we come from. So we think that it is a key to planning with limited resources, with a higher demand for quality of life, and a key to being able to plan in situations that have less regulatory structure. And for us, that means both, as was mentioned, working in places like Houston, but also in places in the developing world where those regulatory structures may not be as strong as well. And so we've seen a sort of direct connection between the work that we do in a city like Houston and overseas. And we see it also, we see the ability to bring a lot of these ideas into the way that planning's done in cities that do have a strong regulatory structure, working in places like Austin or Pittsburgh or Salt Lake City, that a lot of these sort of key methods that we end up using are also useful in these other places, though in a lot of cases we actually have to work through a regulatory structure that doesn't necessarily want us to engage with people in the same sorts of ways that we would in some of these other places. So all of this comes out of an understanding of thinking about the planning process as being about taking social relationships and creating a physical world for those social relationships to work in. But we also understand that once those things are implemented, they also have they reflect on the social relationships that come out of those spaces. So we think that it's a relationship that goes in both directions. So we have to build in a way that's sensitive to the way that people are living their lives, but we also have an ability to affect the way that people are living their lives through what we're built. So it's sort of a difficult relationship, and it's a relationship that's always shifting, and we really want to work to try and understand those sorts of things. So let me talk about our role in the process and what we do as planners in these sorts of situations in order to drive forward these ideas of human infrastructure and the way that we actually work. So for us, it's all about creating a vision as a starting point in any plan. For us, the key way to make sure that you're not creating a plan that ends up sitting on the shelf is that that plan is fostering a vision in the people that gets people excited about seeing it through to completion. We don't want to create plans that don't excite people because we think that it's very difficult to create the political will to get anything done if people aren't excited about the planning process. And so we like to think of what we do as something that's very fun and exciting, not as a bureaucratic process. And that's really important to the way that we work. We work a lot in disaster recovery situations. We've done work in Houston, New Orleans, Japan, Haiti, and really working around the creation of active workshops around some of those issues that people are working on. The challenge for us in disaster recovery is that people are very concerned with their immediate needs personally after a disaster and are not as well situated to begin to think about the way that the community as a whole is going to move forward. People want to get their roofs fixed, and that's understandable. We want to be able to talk about that, but talk about it within the context of how a community can actually recover, and really focusing people's energy into thinking about the ways in which the human infrastructure of a community has been affected by a disaster event. To give an example of that, in New Orleans, as we began to work through some of the recovery issues that we were having, one of the first things that we'll actually do is sit down and map out a community in terms of its relationships of people to other people. Who knows what people within the community, who knows people outside of the community who can help with different things, politicians, or people who are running different agencies, and try to actually create a web of understanding of what the internal and external connections are to resources that people will need. And one of the things that we find out often in one of those processes is that there are actual people who know other people who are missing because they have not been able to return to their homes, and certain social capital within this infrastructure of people tends to be missing. And so coming up with solutions that actually begin to bring some of those people back, whether that is actually a specific person or whether it is people who work in, for example, in New Orleans, school teachers and first responders were almost entirely gone from a lot of the communities that we were working with. So looking specifically at if there were ways to influence in the planning or in development of physical infrastructure, ways of helping to bring those people back. In New Orleans, what we did is we actually created a fund for new housing redevelopment that helped specifically teachers and first responders to be able to move back into new homes in the community in order to help rebuild that type of social capital and restitch together those neighborhoods in a way that really helped them work. We talk a lot about the facing realities of limited resources and really helping communities to understand what exactly they have in terms of resources and how they can be used. The pictures that you see here are from a recent project that we're still actually working on. It's almost approved, fingers crossed, to redesign the bus system for the city of Houston. And in this project, our goal was, that was laid out for us was, okay, so we have a bus system that was designed essentially in 1982. It's had some small changes since then, but essentially it has not kept up with the way that population has changed in Houston, which the way that, when this bus system came into place, there were 2 downtowns, now there are 7. The jobs have shifted, the population has shifted, and we were faced with having a system where almost every bus went downtown. I actually lived in downtown Houston, and within 4 blocks of my house, there were 95 different bus routes. So this wasn't necessarily the best use of resources. The brief that we were given is, okay, if you were starting from 0, you don't have to pay any attention to what the system is right now, but you do have to use the exact same budget that we are spending right now. How would you design this bus system? And in order to help do this, we created a group of stakeholders that represented different communities, represented the business community, represented the elected officials in the city. We sat them down, and there was about 200 of them. And generally when you have those sort of conversations, especially with the elected officials, they want great bus service on every street that runs through their district. What we did is we actually created a game where we broke up the entire city in these mile-by-mile squares. We gave them information about exactly how much population and how many jobs were in each one of those squares. And then we gave them little chips that represented different levels of bus service. So it could be a grid of service that runs every 15 minutes, and that was worth 8 points. Linear routes that are spaced every half mile and only run every 30 minutes would be 2 points, and so on. And then we gave them an actual budget that was essentially the budget that we had with the bus system. And what we found that was really fascinating as we began to work through this gaming and see the way that people began to allocate resources is that almost everybody came to a very similar conclusion. And so helping them as the stakeholders in this area really understand the challenges that planning was up against in this area and be able to translate that into a plan has been a way for us of really building a consensus around understanding how we can move forward with it. And so despite the fact that we're literally wiping the old bus system off the map and putting a new bus system in place, it really looks like it is going to be fully approved as it is, and they're just going to flip a switch one day. The old bus system will go away and the new bus system will come in. So it's a massive project, and to be able to do it with as little political ramifications as there have been has really been a huge success story, and we think is really based around understanding the way that people fit into a planning process. So we also like to do things that lead by example, and we do a lot of physical design things. We get people involved in the planning process. We make people ambassadors for their community. We have them help us organize public events and public engagement strategies. And we use a lot of what's been called tactical urbanism, doing really hands-on stuff in terms of improving the neighborhoods and getting people involved in the planning process. We really like to think that if people actually see something physical happening during a planning process, then they really believe that change is possible, and they are going to be involved after a planning process too in actually being able to implement things.
I'm going to mention that.
Yes, yeah. So I'm going to talk about a few examples. So talking about this idea of human infrastructure, we had the opportunity to actually do a neighborhood revitalization plan for the neighborhood that our office is in. So this is a really fun one for us because we're actually getting to talk about the community that we are actually in. And this is a neighborhood at Washington Avenue corridor in Houston that it's a transitioning industrial community that has seen a lot of redevelopment. The industrial areas have seen a lot of new restaurants and bars, which has been a challenge for long-term residents. And the residential areas, because there is no zoning in Houston, have largely transitioned from being small bungalows. And what will happen is that a developer will take one small bungalow and take that small lot and put 6 townhouses on it. So it's seen a pretty massive increase in its density and its population, but especially in just the density of building fabric. It's gone from being a relatively open, airy neighborhood to somewhere where on both sides of a street that's only 30 feet wide, you're going to have 4-story townhouses lining the whole thing. So it's been a very difficult transition for people. One of the first things that we did was go out and talk to both business owners and people in the community about some of the things that they thought was a real draw in the community. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over again was the arts in the community. And that included for even the business owners that we were talking to, street art was one of the reasons that they felt that the community had a really interesting brand, and it was a reason that people were deciding to locate there because it had this sort of young, hip feel that came from a lot of that. So one of the first things we did in this planning process was taking these things that exist in the community and trying to find new ways to bring them even further forward. And so we worked with a number of building owners who actually had properties that were formerly industrial, were waiting to be turned over. There were a lot of these properties in the community, and worked with them to find a number of legal walls for street artists. And so basically we ended up putting out a call on Facebook, and large parts of the neighborhood got turned into essentially gallery space for street artists. And we were initially a little concerned about this. We thought it was an interesting experiment, but we wanted to see sort of how it was maintained and whether or not people kept to the areas that they were supposed to be painting on. This has been going on for about 3 years now, and it's been absolutely remarkable. You never ever see graffiti in the neighborhood going where it is not a free legal wall anymore, which has been a really interesting thing to see. The artists themselves curate it. It comes, it roughly shuffles through every 3 months or so. People will come back out and repaint things, so the gallery is constantly changing. And having an office that's actually in this corridor, we can actually see, people drive up in their cars pretty much all day long coming to view art, take pictures. We see a whole lot of rap videos being filmed in these parking lots adjacent to these things. It's been really interesting to see the ways in which this sort of curated space has really been a drive for more artists getting out in the community. And in the meantime, since then, the neighborhood has actually gotten a state designation as an arts district. And so there's actually state money now flowing into other types of art that are going on. We're working now on a wayfinding system for the community that ties back to a website where the artists who are living in the community can actually link their work, and as you're walking around the community, you can go zap one of these signs with your smartphone, and it will take you and show you art that's being made on the street that you're on. So we're finding new ways now. This is a very basic way. Essentially, this cost us nothing at all. But now that we're beginning to get some funding for different things, we're finding new ways to bring more art into the area. Washington Avenue corridor, yeah. So it's called like the Lower Washington Cultural Arts District or something like that now is the official name. We looked at some of the very specific needs that were happening in the community. That there really weren't street trees. There were a lot of sidewalks that were in bad repair. None of the bus stops had seating, and we worked with community members. We essentially gave them a pattern for tearing apart seating pallets and turning them into benches, and community members helped us actually create benches for all of these communities, and it was really fun to see these go into use. They're stolen about every 3 months and have to be replaced, but that's not the worst. Since again, they're essentially free. They're done by community labor and so on. And this is another example where this again was about 3 years ago when we started doing these seats. The neighborhood, through some of the redevelopment funds that they've been able to gain, is now actually going to be putting in actual bus shelters at all of these stops now a few years later, based on some of the sort of TERS tip funding that they've been able to acquire through some of the redevelopment that's happened. And the same thing with street trees, working with a nonprofit that donates trees and community labor to actually get trees put in, and especially looking at some of the where we can provide shade around some of these bus stops and things like that. And these are all things that are happening in parallel to a more formal planning process. So these are ways that we're getting the community engaged and thinking about community change while we're also doing this plan that's going to hit these larger infrastructure sorts of issues at the same time. Again, curb delineation, because it's an industrial neighborhood, generally there are no curbs. It's just the sidewalk and street blend together, and so people parking or parking vehicles actually up on the sidewalk and things like that was a huge problem. So working again with a nonprofit to get materials donated to actually do these sort of planting things to delineate where curbs are was something that people were telling us they wanted in order to have a more walkable area. Yeah.
What kind of timeline do you usually plan for?
So generally the planning processes that we go through will be between 9 months and a year, and then we are generally planning for a 15 to 20 year horizon, though the further out you get, the less specific we get. There are sort of goals and vision that lasts in a longer sort of way, but we think that really that first 2 years is really, really important to have very specific things that you can move forward with immediately. And then the 3 to 5 year range for some of the larger infrastructure things where it's really about having to go out and get funding. Those are really the areas where we think that it's really most important. And part of the reason I say that is because in this particular neighborhood, 56% of the buildings in the neighborhood were built in the last decade. So if we had been doing a plan 15 years ago that was trying to say what the vision was for this community 20 years out, it would look totally different because no one would have imagined that the sort of townhouse redevelopment that was going to come through this area was present. So we really want to have the highest thought in the planning process about the time period that we're going to be able to impact the most, and then hope that a community is able to kind of come back to the plan as time goes on and sort of update what's going on in that longer time frame. We also were really interested in using, you guys have probably heard of a Better Block. They were started in Dallas by a firm up there, or actually a couple of artists who became a firm later up there. We were really interested in using that sort of methodology in actually beginning to engage the community. And as a firm that's been hired and has a relatively limited budget, doing these sorts of events can be very difficult to pull off. So what we did instead was we collected a bunch of the community members who were the most excited about the planning process and put them in charge of this. So we supported them being able to put this together and then did it together with them as a sort of part of the planning process. So in this case, rather than a streetscape, we chose to take over this small triangular parcel that was, because of the parking requirements, essentially unbuildable, and say, this could be a place that could be a really neat neighborhood park in the future. What if we do a Better Block one-day festival thinking about what this space could be like? In addition to this, there were 8 vacant buildings surrounding this parcel at the time. There was one bar that was already there, but other than that, all of the spaces around it were vacant. So we also wanted to work with those property owners and find people who would do temporary pop-up businesses in a lot of those spaces as well, to begin to think about what the space could be as a public space, but then also how that ties into the ways that this district could actually function. And so we brought out things like we had free bike rentals. We gave tours of the area that actually tied into some of the planning process that we were doing. Information booths. We had been doing, through the process, we had an interactive website where we allowed people to come on and just give suggestions for the community. And it was very open-ended. All it was, I want blank on Washington Avenue. So you could give any idea you wanted. We took a number of those ideas and actually put them into place on the ground that day on the plaza that we were doing, and then also put up a signboard that tied people back to, this is something that a community member asked for. Here are the challenges to getting it established, whether that was a legal challenge or a regulatory challenge or just something that someone would need to come in order to do to actually make those sorts of things permanent. And as I said, we were interested in really activating the streets, getting people out, painted in crosswalks. We actually, the street section itself was a wide street section with a huge turn lane that was not necessary. So we did narrow the street by a couple lanes, and we laid down AstroTurf in the turn lane to show what it would be like if it had a planted median instead, and put some trees out there. So we did some things to the street. And then we engaged it with a lot of live music and other events that were happening throughout the day. And as I said, we were really interested in doing some of these pop-up shops, bringing in some food trucks. So we had, a market, a coffee shop. One of the coolest ones, the one that's in that upper left-hand corner from your perspective, there was a old pharmacy building adjacent to it that whenever it had closed, which I think was in about 1968, the owner had just locked the door and all of the product and stuff was still in there. It was just this amazing time capsule. You literally went in and, the newspapers that were on the stand were about Ike. It was just totally crazy. And so we didn't actually put a pop-up shop in it, but we got them to open it and we cleaned it up for them. We took off the layers of dust so people could just come in and see this weird piece of history that was in the middle of the neighborhood. And it was really pretty spectacular. I think it was one of the coolest things that we were able to do. It was, this old style pharmacy where the doctor worked out of the back room and they had a soda jerk and all of this other stuff and served hamburgers, and it's a really neat space. So now we are 3 years later than this. That parcel is being redeveloped that has open space on it. That's been something that they've been able to get some city funding for. Every single one of the vacant storefronts is now either a restaurant or a bar. So we have seen a sort of complete turnaround of the idea of what that little area can be. And most of them are actually still in construction. I think 3 of them have opened. The rest will be open later this year. So we're going to really see this regeneration of this area that really did not have much investment at all. And we think that that really is directly tied to the 1,000+ people who came out for this one day to think about what this could be in their community. We like to also think about creating spaces for sharing. And I already told you a little bit. I'll actually show you some images of some of the web-based stuff that we've done. But one of the things that we really like to do is find a space within the communities that we're planning. In this particular case, our office was right there, so it was really easy for us to do. And actually really open that up to the community, have opening hours, have times when people can show up and talk about the community, actually bring people in for open houses where it's much less formal than a public meeting. It's just an opportunity to come and meet your neighbors and talk about the future of the community. And so that's something that we really like to try and do as we're doing these sorts of planning processes. Finding a lot of different modes for sharing. The I Want on Washington Avenue, that was our website, but we also created these large posters and banners that we were able to take around the neighborhood and actually leave outside with markers attached to them so that people could come and write their ideas. And only about 5% of what was written was dirty jokes. So we felt like that was pretty successful. You know, you always run into some of these challenges, but giving some kind of creative ways for people to engage with that while they're waiting at a bus stop or attending an event. And then also sort of facilitating this virtual conversation. And I think that this is really one of the most interesting things that has come into planning in the last few years. And I've already said that I think that planning is really at its core about our job is to organize social relationships in physical space. But I think as the web has opened up these new realms of social connections that happen in virtual space, I think it's really appropriate for planners to have something to say about the way that social relationships are organized in virtual space too, and then the way that that ties back to physical space. So I'm really interested in the ways in which planning can begin to engage with social media in a stronger way. And I think that it's really a kind of neat move in planning in general that there is this conversation now about technology and how it relates back to what we're doing as planners. So we created this website along with a group called Neighborland out of New Orleans, where people could go on and they could have their ideas about Washington Avenue. There were very few, I mean, there wasn't much of a framework for it. It's just, what do you want? And then your neighbors can come in and they can also say, yeah, I like that too, and you can have a conversation about it. And it's an interesting thing because some of the things that people want to talk about are things that the public sector can provide. So for example, somebody mentioned on here that there was a bike trail that was going through a major intersection, and they felt like that light timing was just really bad for cyclists, and they felt it was dangerous. And so they put something about that on this site, and someone from the city saw it and went and fixed it. You know, it was that easy. At the same time, there are things that community members themselves can contribute to the community. Not in Washington Avenue, but in one of the similar pilots in New Orleans, someone went on and said that they wanted a night market in a particular neighborhood in New Orleans, and a bunch of users on the website got excited about that and put together a little nonprofit and started it, and it's been running. And it also can actually be something that the private sector can provide. You know, they can, you know, if you get 500 people on a website saying, man, I really wish there was an Ethiopian restaurant here, that's really interesting market research for someone who's thinking about opening a restaurant in that community. So they know that there's a sort of built-in market for things. So we found that that was a really useful tool, and actually being so open-ended allowed it to go in a lot of different directions. And I think as we think about planning, we really try not to craft plans that are all public sector, all private sector. We really want to understand how the public, private, nonprofit, and community members themselves interact. And when we get into actually doing recommendations, making sure that there are things that each one of them can affect that moves towards this common vision is something that we really want to try and build into a good plan. We did a lot of walking and biking tours and actually getting out in the community with community members and seeing it, helping them see it from our perspectives. And as a planner, our perspectives are really, they're changed by the sort of access to data that we have and the knowledge of sort of deeper processes of planning that go on. So those are actually very interesting to community members. Our view of their community is interesting to community members. Likewise, we really want to understand a community member's view of their own community. So finding ways in which we can actually share those things we find to be really useful. We also often do these right before we do more standard public meetings. And if anyone's been to a public meeting, you know there's always someone who shows up and just wants to talk about the pothole in front of your house. And it's, that's not That's not really what we're there to talk about. And what we found is when we take people on these tours, it gives them all a common experience from which to begin to talk about the things that we want to be able to talk about at the community meetings. So in actually starting with a shared experience and then using that as a jumping off point to talk about a vision for the community, we find that we actually head off a lot of those people who want to be off topic. And that's been something that's been really interesting for us. We didn't necessarily expect that that was what was going to happen when we started doing that, but we found that it really did help focus. So what we found out about this, there's usually a process in planning where you have this sort of community engagement process, and then you go into design, and then you go into construction, and then you go into operations. What we really want to try and set up is something where all of these things are happening more iteratively, and that the community is really empowered to be a part of each one of those phases rather than getting engaged and then dropping off and having to wait 5 years until something is done. And so as we're moving through the planning processes, we're also really thinking about the ways in which community members can continue the process once our particular contract is done. And so a lot of the web-based materials that we set up, we just turn over to the community and let them keep running them. We make sure that the community members who've been the most involved really understand the nitty-gritty of what's in the plan and what it's going to take to implement it, in terms even of the things that are way beyond their control, but understanding what city departments they need to be talking to about the plan as they're moving forward, and making sure that there actually is a structure within the community of someone who's going to take ownership of this plan and keep it moving on as we go on. And we think that that's really important to plans being successful and being kept in the public imagination in a way that helps them move forward. So it really for us is about catering our engagement to the specific needs of the community, and that looks really different in a lot of different places. In a community like Washington Avenue, where the arts were such a big part of it, finding creative ways to do art as a part of the engagement was something that was really useful to us. But looking at potential for gaming, looking at potential for engaging younger people or older people, giving people in the community jobs to do for us, actually even to the extent in Washington, we actually had people collecting data for us. We brought in a whole bunch of interested community members and taught them what we were looking for in sidewalks, for example, and had them out documenting which sidewalks were in good condition and which weren't. And people were really excited to do that for their community. So it really helped us extend what we were able to do too, because it wasn't eating into the fee that we're trying to go home and eat at the end of the day on. So looking at the ways in which we can use human capital in order to help really drive forward that planning process, and really using the infrastructure of people that are in a community and that know a community and want communities to get better, but helping them to figure out ways to do that and helping them to know that there are other people in the community who think the same way that they do has been really important for us. And then making sure that we're not doing these things in isolation. And as I said, it's really important to us that we are thinking about public sector, private sector, nonprofits, and community members themselves, and really working to help tie them together in a way, and making sure that those literal human connections between this person needs to know that person in order for this to move forward is something that we're doing during the planning process as well in order to help it move forward. And I think that's my last slide. Yep, that is my last slide. So I'd love to have a conversation about these things and what you guys think.
Well, thank you very much.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Going to the example of the bus routes, where you played this game, how do you, because I'm assuming your firm also has people with technical, like forecasting, computer modeling type of skills as well. How do you take these technical skills and integrate them with the human infrastructure?
That's a good question. We tend to try to make the technological things that are going on as invisible as possible to the community, but certainly we're bringing to bear, as you said, a lot of different technical issues when we are when we are beginning to do these sorts of things. In that case, part of it is just about careful game design and making sure that the narrative that we're providing and the understanding that people have out of what they're doing is in line with the more technical aspects of what it's going to take to redo a bus system. So we really want to make sure that the engagement is tailored to the type of data that we've been receiving, and that it's not going to actually come in conflict later on. So I would say that that's, for us, the really important part of it is bringing to bear a lot of our technical knowledge very, very early in the process, so that we can tailor the engagement that goes on to the understanding that we have.
Can
Does
I
that
ask
make
a
sense?
follow-up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Organizationally, in terms of the team that you actually are putting, the consulting team that you're putting out there, how do you what's your organizational strategy to handle that? Do you have the technical person works side by side with the person designing the game? Are they the same roles? How does that?
So, it depends again on what sort of a project. Generally, in like a redevelopment project, community redevelopment project, we would have a team that consists at the very least of an engineer, an architect, and a planner, and then we also usually fulfill a landscape architecture role if that's necessary. Sometimes a public engagement person, but I think that all planners should be able to do public engagement. So generally, we like to do that sort of as a group thing. In terms of some of the very specific technical things, so if we're actually creating a website or something like that, we will generally work with people who are better suited to that. In the case of the game that was designed for the bus, we designed it as a paper game first, and then we hired a game designer separately on a sort of separate RFQ process to do the actual online version of it for us. This is one of those places where our connections to Asia tend to be really nice for us, because there are a lot of really, really good web and game designers working out of places in Southeast Asia especially, that help us to do it on a budget that communities can actually afford, because unfortunately working with American companies on a lot of those tech issues can be very, very expensive. That said, we also have a network that I work with of planners who are really interested in those tech issues and are doing some of those things themselves. And I think that that's going to be a growing field. People who actually have a planning/IT background are going to be really in demand in terms of being able to do some of those things and add value on a planning project themselves.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the public engagement processes, of course, you're always going to have people that bring up issues that maybe your sponsors or clients wouldn't want to actually achieve.
Yeah.
But maybe they create a significant following.
Yeah.
What do you do both on the front end and then during the process to kind of deal with the dissonance between what the public is saying and what a client is expecting?
Yeah, that is a really difficult, and in a lot of cases, that's one of the reasons that a client will come to us and say, we really don't know if we really want you doing all this stuff. Our experience has been that if you have an open process, you are actually generally able to get to a solution that everyone is okay with. In this case, on the Washington case, there are some things that the city is not really all that excited about, but the level that we were able to get to was, well, if the community can figure out a way to pay for that, we won't stand in the way of it. And that was kind of good enough, I think, in that particular case. So the city was okay with having some things in a plan that are not necessarily something that is city responsibility that they were okay with. And so that, I think, is one of the best ways to try and do it, if you can foster an open dialogue between the two to be able to do that. Most of the time when people come to me and say those sorts of things as a client, assuming we manage to actually still have an open process, will end up usually being pretty shocked that everyone is pretty much in alignment. I think communities have an inherent knowledge of some of the things they need that often line up with what the city thinks they probably need to provide. It's just a sort of trust matter between the communities and the cities, and hopefully that's something that we can help overcome through this sort of a process if they're open to it. Yeah.
How do you deal with situations that these must arise where there's just a lot of disagreement within communities?
Yeah.
About just diametrically opposed visions that just can't be resolved through mutual learning and so forth?
We will use a lot of the time. There are consensus building processes that are actually used a lot in business development circles that we've sort of grabbed onto to try and help people work through that. Generally, the way that we try and do it is that we try and get both those camps into a room, and we nail down, what both of them are asking for, and we bring those sorts of things out to the community and actually do preference surveys with the community, and then we take those preferences back into a room and come up with whatever the consensus is between them. And generally, it's not going to be what either one of them really wanted, but as long as they can see the process that led to those things and that what they were talking about got respected in that process, generally they end up being ready to champion it. And so not always, there's always going to be outliers to that, but having that open conversation and trying to find common ground between people who think that they're diametrically opposed can actually really, really help. And bringing out voting processes especially that make it so that even the people who are not talking in the room can have their voice heard in some way, because often, it's a couple of loud people who maybe no one agrees with in the room who are having out those sorts of arguments. Can be really helpful.
Do you use things like clickers to try to make
Sometimes, but I prefer making people put like physical dots up on things so that it's very transparent in terms of the process. You can really see that, everyone can look around the room and see, oh, well, that got way more dots than I thought people would think about that. So we use those things. But we do make it clear that, this isn't straight up voting. We're not straight up choosing exactly what that one is. We're going to look at, the top 4 things that got votes and then see if there's a way to craft them into, a solution. So that it is, sort of weighted voting, I guess.
I'm curious about Houston. You said, Houston is not like kind of a role model of planners, but on the other hand, it's like the land of opportunity.
Uh-huh.
There is no city that needs more planners than Houston,
Yep.
and they have money.
Yep.
So I want to ask you, do you think that Houston at some point will become like a city like Boston or?
Not like Boston, no. It's always going to be a very weird city, and it's a really fascinating place as a planner because you've got Detroit neighborhoods and you've got Boston neighborhoods and you've got Dubai neighborhoods and you've got everything in between. The west side of the city is growing at just incredible rates, just like Austin. There's no vacancies anywhere or anything. The east side of the city has lost 3/4 of its population and is looks like Detroit and has those same sorts of issues. So as a planner, it really is a pretty fascinating place to be able to work on a lot of different issues all in one place. And I like to say that I don't think Houston's the least developed city. It's the most developing city. And so if you're interested in work in the developing world especially, there's a lot to learn from Houston. That said, there is not a school with a really strong planning program in Houston, and so there are very few planners being produced in Houston. There's very few people who are thinking about Houston and writing about Houston and talking about the ways in which planning is achieved there, which I think is really a shame, and I think everyone in this class should move there and help us build a Houston School of Planning Texas Southern is the school that does have a planning program. It's relatively small, and it tends to be for mostly post-professional people. So a lot of the time there are people who already have jobs somewhere in the sort of in the city somewhere who are adding a degree. But yeah, it could really use. For a city of 5 million people, it could really use a lot more people thinking about what's going on there. And it really has been a fertile place for me thinking about a lot of these issues. And they're in an interesting time for planning. Right now, or within the next year, they're doing the first ever comprehensive plan, the first bike plan in 30 years. They're doing a cultural plan. So there's a lot of really interesting planning things happening right now, too. Makes it a very interesting place. Yeah.
Hi, I've actually been in Houston the last 5 years,
Mhm.
and so I know something about this stuff. And I'm an attorney, so I probably have questions that are different.
Sure.
than other people. Who exactly is the client? Who's paying you to do all this
So
work and philosophy?
most of the funding for planning in Houston comes through federal grants. So it's actually generally run through the Houston-Galveston Area Council, which is their combination, the Regional Transportation Planning Agency and the Council of Governments that's there. And then in order to get that funding, the funding has to be matched by different organizations that have some sort of implementing power. In this particular case, our client was HGAC, TxDOT, and then the money that went into the project was jointly raised by a TERS, a nonprofit, Old Sixth Ward TERS, yep, a nonprofit called Better Houston, and the city. So they all jointly were our client and all jointly put money in. So that was one of the reasons why this was an unusual project, is that we had a public, private, and nonprofit client, essentially, all in the same plan. And the money that the nonprofit raised was primarily coming from donations from developers. So we had that public sector or private sector as well involved in that. So it really was kind of a Frankenstein of a client list. But in reality, I really think that finding new ways to do planning that do incorporate that sort of thing is really interesting. We're actually just now starting off a new planning process. Same funding source from the Houston-Galveston Area Council, but in this case, it is 2 neighborhoods who each have a management district or a community redevelopment agency and a nonprofit together as the clients. And it's an African-American neighborhood and a Latino neighborhood that are on opposite sides of the bayou in Houston. And so they're not neighborhoods that have ever really been thought of together. But over time, they've realized more and more that they are facing the same challenges and that they're competing for resources. So they got together and said, okay, we're going to try this out and see if we can craft a plan for both communities together, and then see how we can actually help each other achieve some of these resources. So it's a really interesting one. 5th Ward and 2nd Ward. The Buffalo Bayou Partnership, yeah, is the other one. So so there's a lot of, it's a neighborhood, and then it's about a mile of industrial properties that are going to turn over with the bayou in the middle, and then another neighborhood. And they've never really thought of each other as being in any way related, So it's a really, again, interesting new model, I think, for the ways that neighborhoods can possibly cooperate on some of these things. So I saw a hand there and then over here.
When you go on these walking tours and biking tours, how do you get people to come with you? How do you get them to come out of their homes and engage in a dialogue with you? Do you just go and knock on random people's doors? Do you activate local community leaders?
Yeah, we advertise them and activate local community leaders. In some cases, I'll lead a tour. In other cases, we actually ask local community people to put together a tour and lead it about something that they're passionate about. So, like we had, a woman who has been doing a lot of community gardening in the area, lead a little tour of the area's community gardens. We had another artist who knew all of these interesting little art pieces that various people had just put up on vacant lots, take us around and show us some of the interesting art that had been done in the community. And so we try and format them in a lot of different ways. We had a really, really good historian come out and talk about, the way the neighborhood was in 1860, and so a lot of those can be really interesting. But we try and mix them up. And then the bike rides, you get different people for different things. The bike rides are going to not appeal to a 60-year-old potentially in the same way that they appeal to 20-year-olds, and so we want to have a mixture of different things that different people are going to find appealing. We actually, in this one too, we also actually did some transit tours where we had a sort of transit expert who was on our team actually take people for a bus ride around the community and talk about some of the improvements that have been made in the bus system and other things that could happen, and just giving people that experience of hopping on some buses and navigating their community that way was something that we also did.
Not to jump back to Houston, but I did my undergraduate in Houston.
Yeah.
I think after living there, I kind of stood back and I feel like Houston doesn't have that sense of like communal identity.
Yeah.
Because, as you mentioned, there's so many different
Yeah.
parts of it. And I guess my question would be, how often do you end up going into placemaking or branding
Yeah.
with that to try to pull, a city as big as Houston
Yeah.
together,
And-
and how that's kind of incorporated into the
Yeah.
community involvement?
We actually do a lot of that sort of thing, and I would say that within individual neighborhoods, especially in the inner loop Houston, it maybe gets a little more vacuous as you move out towards the west. There is actually a really high degree of association with your individual neighborhood, and I think that a lot of that comes from Houston's pretty working class roots. That people have been in places for generations, and where your grandma grew up and all of those sorts of things. So there are a lot of good brands already, but some of them have challenges. I mean, anything with a ward on the end of the name still has challenges because people just hear ward and think that that's drug infested, and that's not the case for almost all of them at this point. But we do include a lot of that, and a lot of like Washington Avenue has an issue where if you ask any realtor, it's a part of the Heights, because that's just the brand that they want to attach onto, and people who live there hate that. They are tied to their individual neighborhoods within the Washington Avenue corridor, so there's like 8 neighborhood groups already within there, and they're tied to Washington Avenue as a whole. So our challenge in this project was coming up with a branding strategy for them that acknowledged both the corridor as a whole, but then also gave a way for people to within each one of these individual neighborhoods to have their own identity too. And so the street signs, for example, that were designed for this, that will eventually be going up, they actually say Washington Avenue Corridor / West End or / First Ward or / whatever, and then actually have an image that's iconic to that particular neighborhood within the street signs. So there is a brand that sort of carries out throughout the corridor, but then also acknowledges the little differences within the corridor. And that'll be the same sort of challenge that we'll have in talking with the 5th Ward and 2nd Ward, because they both really do have their own brands in terms of what they want to put forward. But finding ways for them to be able to move forward without having to become the same place, but still cooperate, I think is going to be the challenge in that one.
I have 2 different questions. One is going back to your response to Jake's question, I think. Having these sort of open processes often tend to lead to certain frustrations within your team.
Mm-hmm.
What has been your experience, in dealing with those sort of uncertainties? And the second, slightly broader question is, what is it that you've been able to learn from your partners in Asia?
Yeah, both good questions. So for the first question, I don't know that I have a lot of frustrations with working in this way. I really, really try to come to a project without knowing what my final solution is going to be. And I of course, you can't help but be a planner and be walking around and think, oh, that could use that or that could use that. But for me, being surprised in these processes and then coming up with solutions for those surprises is always something that's really interesting. I also, in these sorts of projects where we do have multiple clients across different sectors, I think those get really interesting because you really start to see things from different points of view and then trying to come together with a solution. So it gets you outside of this, okay, this is the point of view I would have, just as a planner, but thinking about it from a nonprofit perspective, from a community perspective, and then finding a way to tie them all together is really interesting. And that's something I've taught at Texas Southern for several years doing their studio, and one of the things that we would do in the urban design studio is we would break up the class in teams at the very beginning of the project, where we would all be working on the same neighborhood, but we would give some of them the assignment of your private sector, your public sector, your community, come up with your plan, and then look at the ways in which those different lenses actually shape the outcomes in those final projects. And I think that it's really important to think about the ways in which our lenses as planners are shaping the solutions that we're hitting on. So going to what have we learned from partners in Asia? There's a ton of stuff. I think a lot of my work recently has been in Vietnam, and I've been really interested in looking at the way that government runs in Vietnam and the way that people engage with the government there. They have a system where as an individual you have very little choice as far as your national government goes. When things get to that level, it's very top down, but you have an extreme amount of choice at the neighborhood level. And so the elections that happen at a neighborhood level and the politics that happen at a ward level within Vietnamese cities are really, really dynamic and interesting, and really engaging on a, literally every person having input level because of the way that they've sort of structured the communist society, that you've got these sort of ward leaders, and then you've got their teams that are responsible for 5 families, and when they're doing planning projects, they go out and literally talk to every single person. And I think that those are really, really interesting for thinking about how you can drill down to thinking about democracy in a different way. That folks in that sort of a situation actually have a lot of say in things that really affect them at a neighborhood level, even if they don't at a national level. Whereas I think in the US, a lot of the time we kind of flip that, and we spend a lot of time thinking about national politics and the way that affects it. But our turnout for a council election, if it's in an off presidential year, is maybe 25%. So the things where people are actually would be involved in potentially changing their communities, they're not getting involved in. So I think that's something that's really interesting to me. Methodologically, especially in transportation planning, Asia is so far ahead of the United States right now that it's just totally bonkers to me. And you hear that talking to infrastructure specialists in the world. No one is looking to the United States for infrastructure solutions at this point. That it's really China, Japan, to some extent Europe, but really China that's really on the leading edge of a lot of the infrastructure solutions. And so it's been interesting to see some of those things that are being put in place and the ways that they're thinking about that. And in general, for both Vietnam and China, it's been, there was this process of really fast urbanization in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s too, that most of the stuff that was put up was not of a quality that it can be, they're building these huge cities just out of nowhere. Most of that's not of a quality that it is going to be maintainable in the near future. And so we're starting to move into this period of planning in China and Vietnam that it's what I call the second draft, that they're going to be going back through and really beginning to engage with quality of life issues and more long-term planning issues in these cities that had sprung up, that I think is really